Não muitas pessoas compreendem que o Brasil tem uma das maiores diásporas árabes do mundo. Apesar da tragédia humana e todas as perguntas e perspectivas que existem sobre o atual conflito entre Hammas e Israel, qual seria o papel do Brasil no conflito do Oriente Médio? Eu sou o Claudio Garcia, direto de Nova York, para o MyNews, e te vejo logo depois da vinheta. Olá a todos, bem-vindo ao Conexão Global. A intenção desse programa é compreender como tendências e eventos ao redor do mundo impactam e trazem oportunidades para o Brasil. No programa de hoje, vamos mergulhar no Oriente Médio. Vamos compreender como o trágico conflito entre o Hammas e Israel impacta não só a região, mas o mundo e o Brasil. Para isso, hoje eu vou conversar com um convidado. Hoje nós vamos ter aqui o Robert Riggs. Robert Riggs mora aqui em Nova York, é CEO da Global Intelligence Insights. O Robert é um especialista em risco geopolítico do Oriente Médio e Norte da África. Por muitos anos, o Robert foi pesquisador e professor universitário de História, Economia Política e Religião no Oriente Médio e Norte de África. E um dos seus mais notórios trabalhos foi quando morou no Sudão para implementar sistemas agrícolas sustentáveis, escolas e microempresas em zonas de conflito, regiões com pouquíssimo apoio governamental ou privado, e, portanto, por trás disso, a intenção era evitar, por exemplo, coisas absurdas como tráfico de seres humanos. Eu iniciei minha conversa com o Robert perguntando sobre a origem do atual conflito Hammas e Israel. Existem várias teorias. O Hammas se juntou ao Irã ou ao Líbano, o Hezbollah, para poder pegar Israel de surpresa, ou fez tudo isso sozinho? Vamos ver o que ele fala.
It really seems very unlikely that the regional powers, meaning by that Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, would have had a part in launching this attack or giving it the green light. And there's a few reasons for that. And one is that Hamas came out of the Palestinian Islamic Brotherhood movement, which is a social movement that reaches across the Middle East and North Africa into different countries and takes on different local varieties. And so Egypt has a very tenuous and hostile, the government of Egypt currently has a very hostile relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. And so it's very unlikely that they would have much other than what they had to do practically because they share a border with the Gaza Strip to deal with the Hamas authorities. But Iran has been a sort of a spoiler actor in this conflict for quite a while now. They've found it useful to support Hamas in terms of arming them, training them in how to build rockets and other military strategy. And even something like hostage taking and negotiation with the Israeli authorities. But it's just hard to imagine that Iran would have wanted to see the destruction of one of their critical proxy military forces close to Israel. And that seems like that's the likely outcome of this, is that Hamas is going to be severely degraded. So that leads us to conclude that Hamas planned this attack and decided to do it without notifying we could say the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, superiors. Based on what Hamas sources have been reported to have said since the attack, that a small group within the larger military wing of Hamas and the political wing determined that this was kind of a D-Day event for them, that they were just going to do this and trigger a massive reaction from the Israelis with the hopes of kind of putting the Israel-Palestinian issue back onto the front burner of the news and of people, of kind of global politics. And to that extent, it has succeeded. Now, at what cost? I mean, we're talking about well over 10,000 Palestinians dead and countless thousands that are buried under destroyed buildings that who knows what the final count will be. It doesn't mean that Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon and other sympathetic governments like the Syrian government aren't supporting Hamas in some way. It just means that they preferred to have it be sort of a low-level, asymmetrical warfare between Hamas, Hezbollah, and some of the other militias in Iraq and the U.S. and Israel. Not that it would upend or potentially reorganize the geopolitical situation of the Middle East, North Africa, which now it threatens to do. So,
uma das muitas perguntas que se fazem sobre o atual conflito entre Hamas e Israel é o porquê vários dos países muçulmanos que estão sendo bem agressivos nas suas respostas a Israel, pelo menos da forma como falam, não estão fazendo nada nem pelos refugiados de Gaza, nem em relação à guerra, não estão entrando na guerra. Eu perguntei isso ao Robert. Vamos ver o que ele fala.
Actions and words of, let's say, the Arab League or the Organization of Islamic Countries, or even specific countries within those umbrellas like Iran and Egypt and Jordan, are very carefully calibrated to try to avoid expanding this conflict into a regional war, because it doesn't really benefit any of those countries to see that happen. And of course, in geopolitics and in international affairs, country self-interest is almost always takes precedence over everything else. And I don't think that, despite a lot of the very full-throated support that Ayatollah Khamenei has given from his position as supreme leader of Iran, or the president of Iran has said, we fully support this attack and we celebrate their success. But and they've even said their military leadership has laid down red lines that they've then walked back already. And one of them was that the red line was a ground invasion of Gaza. Now that's ongoing for now over a week, and we don't see any attack or any ramping up of Iran's military or its proxies militaries to do more than what they had been doing prior, which was shooting anti-tank missiles across the border in Lebanon, or shooting long-range ballistic missiles from Yemen all the way towards the southern port Eilat in Israel. That doesn't mean that it couldn't happen if there are missteps or misconceptions or misperceptions on either side. This is the danger zone that we're in, is that once the war has begun, it could spin out of control. If there was a story just recently that said that this drone, an Iranian technology drone, whether it was from Iran or from a militia in Iraq, got through the U.S. military's defenses and hit the second floor of a barracks. Now, no one was killed, but you could imagine that if instead, in an alternate universe, 50 American soldiers were killed, that could trigger some type of response in the U.S. military that would escalate things. Egypt, for certain, I wouldn't say for certain, as much certainty as I can muster, will not get involved on behalf of Hamas because of the reason I said previously, which is that Egypt has just spent the last 10 years suppressing a Muslim Brotherhood led government that was overthrown in a coup that has led to General Sisi continuing to be the president and placing the previous president in jail where he died, Mohamed Morsi. So that gives us a sense of how unlikely it is that Egypt's going to support. Now, Jordan is a bit of a difficult one to predict, because the country of Jordan is home to more than half of its population their heritage is from what is today Israel or the West Bank or Gaza. Jordan, however, has a peace treaty since 1994, 29-year peace treaty with Israel, but they've withdrawn their ambassador from Israel, and they've forced the Israeli ambassador to leave Jordan. Well, he left actually directly after the attacks, but they're not allowing the Israeli ambassador to return unless the war ends, unless there's a ceasefire, which Israel said they're not going to do. So what does this mean for that peace agreement between Jordan, which is facing internal instability from not just its own Palestinian descent population, but also a large number of Syrian refugees that came to Jordan as a part of the Syrian conflict, many of whom left Syria because they were affiliated with the Islamic Brotherhood in Syria, which was one of the major opponents to the Assad regime. So, you can see that there's so many different factors here. Yeah. And most of the countries that I've just mentioned, for example, Iran is struggling under heavy sanctions and its economy is not strong. Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan have such high national debt to GDP ratios that Absolutely. It's shocking that they're even still functioning as states, right? I mean, they're dependencies of the IMF and the World Bank or one of the oil and natural gas rich Gulf states that's propping up their economies, or the US in the case of Jordan.
Dos pontos que muitos ignoram em relação ao conflito é em relação às condições econômicas dos países que estão ao redor de Israel e de Gaza. Eu perguntei ao Robert se isso poderia ser dos fatores que faz com que se evite uma grande guerra na região.
Gone through so many crises in the last 4 years, right? In 2019, there was this large uprising in Lebanon against corruption, and that uprising was also, by the way, directed against Hezbollah MPs who are a part of the Lebanese government. Hezbollah is very entrenched in the Lebanese political system, but the Lebanese population their anger was directed towards Hezbollah against other politicians from the opposition, from Hariri's side, and toward the bankers who allowed, through mismanagement and massive corruption, and continually gaming the international monetary system by getting more and more money by lying about their assets from the IMF and the World Bank. When finally the chickens came home to roost, and their currency devalued in the last 2 years by 97%. 97% of their value, their currency went down versus the dollars. So Lebanon is a very weak state. It's kind of as frustrating as it is for me to say this, having traveled there many times, and I love the country, and I think it's a phenomenal place, but it's really on the edge of being a failed state. Yep. Iraq has never recovered adequately from the war 20 years ago. Yep. And so Syria is a client state of Russia now and Iran, and half its population pre-war is outside of Syria. So you can, it could go on and on, but the direct neighbors to this conflict cannot afford the war to come into their countries.
Bem, está evidente que as questões relacionadas ao conflito vão além da questão Israel-Hammas. Isso impacta o mundo todo. Eu perguntei ao Robert como isso tem impactado toda a região do Oriente Médio e o que se esperar do futuro da região também. Vamos observar o que ele fala.
There's different kind of segments of the Middle East, North Africa that are that have to be looked at discreetly. And one of them is the Gulf Cooperation Council, right? Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman. And this is a region that is setting aside the Yemen conflict, which has never really been resolved since 2011, is a stable economic zone that is has managed to find a way, despite some significant philosophical differences in leadership between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain, whereas Kuwait and Oman play the middle, but has managed to maintain good relations with not just each other, but international trade and commerce, to the point where they're one of the wealthiest sub-regions of the world. Assuming that the world doesn't shift all to renewable energy in the next 5 to 10 years, which it seems unlikely it will, despite the issues with climate change, and that I think everybody's pretty aware of. Those countries have a guaranteed wealth growth trajectory, and so the wild card in this is Iran, because in that region, because Iran, of course, is also dependent on oil and natural gas sales, and they've managed to, particularly in the Biden post-Trump era, have managed to move closer to Russia and especially to China, which is very energy needy, let's say, and India and Japan, which are also energy needy, and subvert sanctions, and they or we can say the sanctions haven't been robustly applied by the Biden administration in the way they were during the Trump administration, or even the early part of Obama, when he was trying to get them to the table for a negotiated nuclear agreement. So Iran's economy is kind of in a growth zone right now because of its ties to the East, and it's looking east. And so assuming that this doesn't shift into a U.S., Iran, Israeli war, in which case all bets are off, but assuming that Iran will do their best to avoid that, because it's not in their self-interest to have their regime severely debilitated, if not destroyed. Assuming those things, which I think we can safely assume, all things considered, Iran is probably going to come out of this potentially stronger, because they're vocally supporting the Palestinians, and materially as well, through various black market ways. They get their materials to Hamas or to Hezbollah to create the rockets and the drones and things. And
E o que vai acontecer quando a guerra acabar? Vamos ver finalmente Estado palestino?
From the side of the Israeli and Hamas, it's a really difficult to know if, despite the massive destruction that Israel's military can wreak on just about any country in the region, that doesn't guarantee that they're going to eradicate or eliminate Hamas, as they've been saying. And the reason for that is because they're not addressing the underlying fact that Hamas is a social movement. It's not just a group of militants with weapons, and that's one of the reasons you can point to and it's not a group that is based in a otherworldly ideology like ISIS, which had no problem exploding themselves and using suicide missions because of the idea of it being a cosmic war between, good and evil, and they were soldiers in that, supernatural war. But in the case of Hamas, it's materially based. It's based on a land dispute between an ethno-national land dispute between two different groups. Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel, who has been the longest serving prime minister, I believe, in Israel's history, has a long track record of taking actions that would debilitate or even destroy various accords and agreements between the previous other Israeli administrations and the Palestinian leadership. and I mean more specifically the Oslo Accords, that were intended to lead through a set of progressive steps to an independent Palestinian state in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip, led by the Palestinian Authority, which was the reclassified PLO. 3 years after that agreement, 1 year after that agreement was signed, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a ultra-nationalist religious Jewish extremist, Israeli Jewish extremist. And 2 years after that, Benjamin Netanyahu was first elected as prime minister and proceeded to do whatever he could in his position to not carry out that agreement. And the main way of not carrying out that agreement is to allow settlements inside of the territory that had been agreed upon to be the future Palestinian state. It's beggars belief to imagine that any Israeli government is going to have the political courage to withdraw 500,000 of their citizens from the West Bank in order for there to come into existence a Palestinian independent state. And that can't be disconnected from the Gaza issue, because both territories were intended to be part of one unified Palestinian state. So when Hamas participated in elections, just like Hezbollah had done in Lebanon, also, they ended up winning in the election in 2006. They appeared to win a majority of the seats in the Palestinian parliament. And at that point, the administration of George W. Bush and the administration of Benjamin Netanyahu did not allow that government that would have been essentially at least a plurality, would have been Hamas MPs, to rule, but instead they supported the Palestinian Authority group called Fatah, led by the successor to Yasser Arafat, who's still in charge now. This war will eventually come to an end. It's going to cost tens of thousands of lives combined between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And it's unlikely to lead to an Israeli government that is going to be willing to negotiate with the Palestinians or restart the Oslo Accords or take up another peace plan like the Arab peace plan in 2002, where the king of Saudi Arabia said, all the Arab countries will make peace with Israel if you guys just give Palestine your state. So those are all things that are on the table, but it's unlikely that any of them will take place, because usually in times of war, nationalist governments win elections. And so even if Netanyahu, who last time I saw a poll is widely vilified and blamed by the Israeli public for what happened, even if he ends up resigning or losing and a new government takes his place, it's hard to imagine that government in Israel's democratic system is going to come out more pro-Palestinian.
Dos grandes problemas do Oriente Médio é que as grandes potências globais estão muito envolvidas na região, principalmente Rússia e Estados Unidos, mas não menos e cada vez mais a China. Como a guerra, o atual conflito Hammas-Israel irá impactar as relações de poder do mundo, que já estão bastante abaladas? Perguntei também isso ao Robert.
It's an open question about how overstretched the U.S. hard power is, right? So the U.S. military is still, I know there's been some talk of it not, but I still think it's indisputably the world's most powerful military. But the U.S. has been sending billions of dollars to Ukraine for over a year. Now it's much more than a year, and weaponry and support to Ukraine. And the Europeans have been kind of ramping up industrial production of weapons to try to support Ukraine. And now if the U.S. is required, and the U.S. is, since Obama's administration has been trying to implement his quote unquote pivot to Asia, but which includes providing security guarantees for Japan and for Taiwan and the Philippines and others, so, and at the same time, we're looking here domestically at the U.S. Having another government shutdown because the dispute between the Republicans and the Democrats over how much debt is too much debt, and those things all play into the same question of is an economy, the U.S. economy that is so military industrial heavy, is sustainable. The U.S. and China still are massive trade partners despite the current hostility, and although there is this attempt to sort of de-link to some extent, but what is that going to mean? I don't think it's going to mean that the U.S. is going to somehow take down China like the Soviet Union or something like that. I think it's gonna probably lead to a more bipolar world, where there's a group of countries that are forced to choose between these two great powers, and then a group of others, maybe Brazil's one of them, that can just thread the needle. And it kind of it's sort of an interesting idea that with a massive economy like Brazil's that has good, I think, decent diplomatic relations with all sides, or India, for example, or South Africa, or maybe even some other rising economies in Africa, or maybe Malaysia, Indonesia, that these countries could maybe start to play a larger role in mediating, global conflicts and disputes. That in theory, that was the founding reason for the UN to exist. But now the UN's effectiveness is really limited to its aid and relief programs. There's to say that this is going to shift things, but I wouldn't overplay it to say it's going to shift it, change everything and suddenly rearrange all of global and international politics and economics. I think it's just it's likely to exacerbate some chasms or, some divisions, and some places are going to have to look for new trade partners, or going to try to strengthen, partnerships with countries they've already developed trade relations with.
E, finalmente, o Brasil. Eu tinha comentado que o Brasil tem uma das maiores, se não a maior, diáspora árabe do mundo. Mais do que isso, se juntarmos todos os países árabes do norte da África e do Oriente Médio, eles seriam, juntos, o terceiro maior parceiro comercial do Brasil, depois de Estados Unidos e China. Qual é o papel e a oportunidade do Brasil em relação ao Oriente Médio? O que a guerra, apesar de trágica, pode representar de oportunidade para o nosso país?
I think there's a tremendous opportunity here for, bilateral trade and investment for Brazil, because there's a few reasons for this. One is that, as you mentioned, the youthful population of the Middle East is not going to change in the next 20 years. Some of the countries have a very high average birth rate, and they also have economies that are very top heavy, with a lot of state sectors are huge and the private sector is small. So from an economic perspective and investment perspective, I think there's a great opportunity there, as long as there's patience to deal with the bureaucracy. But it's not a situation like China, where you have these turnkey operations. You have to kind of agree, essentially sign your life away as a company to work in China, right? It's different. Now, the Gulf countries have some private public partnership between royal family and other public. I think those countries are probably the easiest ones to do business with for Brazil, because they are stable, established monarchies where the leadership are royal families who can make quick decisions and can ease the way through the bureaucracy, if you have the right intermediary and people to communicate and work those deals. But there are other opportunities in countries where that are growing but that aren't as stable, depending on how risk averse or not risk averse in Brazilian investors are, because there are countries that are in the process of rebuilding, like Syria or Iraq, which have gone through severe internal civil conflicts, but now have stability to some level. And they also are, in fact, in much higher need of a lot of different products that the Brazilian economy could export to them, and even things like basic staples and cereals and other things. Of course, the Middle East and North Africa generally is the driest region in the world too, and it's only getting drier because of climate change. And so there's a great opportunity for agribusiness and the agricultural sector in Brazil to export there, because despite the attempts on the part of some of the large countries in the region to try to be internally food sufficient, it's really a losing battle, and it doesn't make sense economically for them. And almost undoubtedly more cost effective to just import it from Brazil. So that's just one example, but there are a lot of other sectors of the Middle East, North African economies that are, I think, really phenomenal, investment opportunities for the Brazilian economy. And I think it would be a really, there's another side of this from the political side of it, the geopolitical side, which is there's a really big upside to having an honest broker in the region. And as far as I know, Brazil and there's a few other countries like it around the world that are generally viewed well by all sides, right? And that's not a minor factor to take into account in the context of the Middle East, North Africa. If you can come in with a less of any kind of sectarian or political bias, I think that's going to open a lot of doors for bilateral trade and investment, and that can lead to diplomatic breakthroughs potentially. Despite all the current human tragedy and bloodshed and chaos that appears on the screens, I still think that the region has tremendous potential, a growth potential, and hopefully we'll see this conflict come to an end soon.
Bem, o Robert falou coisas muito importantes aqui. Primeiro, deu para entender, claro, que mesmo um conflito regional como esse tem implicações enormes para a região, que já economicamente já não está tão bem assim. Além disso, as implicações são enormes também para as grandes potências globais e toda a disputa de poder e de econômica e política que está acontecendo ao redor do mundo. Tem muito para acontecer ainda e tem muito para ser observado. Mas eu acho que o mais importante aqui que fica de ponto para podermos refletir é em relação ao Brasil e como o Brasil tem uma oportunidade diplomática, política, econômica em relação a um grupo de países que representaria hoje o terceiro maior parceiro comercial do nosso país ao redor do mundo. E uma região que tem um potencial muito grande no futuro. Tem muito risco envolvido, mas o retorno pode ser muito maior. E você, concorda com o que o Robert comentou nessa entrevista? Concorda com o que eu falei agora no final? Comente, curta, compartilhe. E te vejo na próxima Conexão Global.